there. Welcome to the Study and Learning Centre's Graduate Research and Know-How series. I'm Dr. Jen Anderson, and this workshop looks at the steps for critical reading. You'll be invited to complete activities and then listen to the discussion about possible answers. In this workshop, we're going to explore number 1, academic reading purposes, and number 2, reading for text relevance. For this workshop, you'll need to download a copy of the article Trees and Urban Forestry in Beijing, China. You'll find it just under this workshop link. Why don't you pause the video now and maybe open it up in a new tab and download that article now. Okay, let's look at HDR reading purposes. The way we read is largely determined by why we're reading. When we read for our research, we're seeking to understand a topic or concept, to interact with the ideas, findings or discussion, and thereby build on our own knowledge. Here are some possible purposes that we might have for reading an academic text. The important thing is, ask yourself what your key purpose is for reading and read with the intention of fulfilling that purpose. So in this little game, you match an image to each bullet point. For example, the eye at the top right might be looking for a broad overview of the field. Pause the video if you want to play the game. The idea of making a critical reading of a text really means thinking deeply about the text. It involves interpretation, reading between the lines to find the inferences and assumptions, and an active conversation between you and the text itself in which you question and evaluate what the text is saying. This is not a relaxing process. It requires focus and energy. What types of critical thinking can we apply to reading? Bloom's revised taxonomy of educational objectives offers a really great hierarchy of thinking functions that lead eventually to creativity. They're remembering, understanding, applying, analysing, evaluating, and creating. So, in early research stages, our first reading of a text will probably focus on remembering and understanding. I'll remind you, this is an example from the humanities, just a general example. When we remember, we can paraphrase, for example, Foucault's ideas about power and resistance. When we understand, we can think of examples that show the relationship between power and resistance. In applying the knowledge, I might illustrate how the colonizers, for example, can be subverted by the colonized. The next level of thinking, analysing, requires more questions. I might ask, what is the character of resistance? I note that many writers talk about resistance as an exercise of freedom. But then I ask myself, yes, but does this change the status quo? What type of freedom is this? And when I ask these questions, I'm evaluating the proposition. And at the final level of creating, I decide to test Foucault's proposition by examining power and resistance in workplace relations. Here's a simple taxonomy of thinking for students of the sciences. In early research stages, our first reading of the text will probably focus on remembering and understanding. First, we remember, for example, that Joe says different disaster management organisations collect different data. When we understand, we can give an example of how this might work. To apply the knowledge, I could create a table that lists disaster management NGOs and identifies the data they collect and the platforms they use. In the next level of thinking, analysing, I might investigate the table I've made to note that the dataset platforms are incompatible and cannot be shared. An evaluation of the problem might lead me to wonder about the implications of disparate databases in terms of overall coordination of disaster management by government agencies, for example. And finally, I might conclude that the development of a universal database on a single platform that different organisations could add to would make for a transparent and collaborative system of disaster management. This is the level of creating. It's time for you to think about your reading skills. What steps do you take when you read a journal article, and how effective are they? To test your effectiveness, you need to ask, do I assess the texts before I read so I can throw it away if it's not relevant? And after I read the text, am I able to say what it's about, what the key points are? Do my notes evaluate the text in terms of validity, reliability, credibility, and value to the field? Do I have a set of notes that include the reference source and relevant page numbers? And have I written the notes in my own words with a couple of seminal quotes? What might make you a more effective reader? Well, that's what we're here to find out. First of all, are you a passive reader or an active reader? You can see here that a passive reader does not ask questions of the text. They do not have a conversation with the author like an active reader does. There's just no point in being a passive reader. It's a waste of your time. The type of text you read depends on what you need to know. For example, if you need to know what a key concept word means, you can start by looking up the dictionary or Wikipedia. Once the basic understanding of the concept is clear, you can proceed to secondary sources and then primary sources. Secondary sources usually offer explanations, commentaries, and critiques of primary sources. They're usually easier to read in the early stages of research. If some of the key ideas you're using come from a particular person, it's important to read them in the original as much as possible. Even translations can be unreliable and offer only an interpretation of the original writer's meaning. Primary sources also include archive materials, treatises, and research reports or articles. For more information on finding texts, visit the library website. Two overarching questions will help you to assess the suitability of the text. When you check the contents page and index, you'll see keywords jumping out at you. Are you familiar with them? What do you already know about them? Is the text going to offer you something more than you already know? Look for other words that suggest concepts or ideas you may be less familiar with. How can I use the content in this text in my research? Is the topic relevant? If it is, then you may already know how it sits in the hierarchy of information, or you may not. What matters is that you know it's probably a useful resource for you to read. Sometimes your supervisor will suggest journal articles and texts that they have found useful and they believe will be useful for you. Find them and assess them. Do these texts support your research intention? If not, put them aside for the moment. Associate Professor Pierre Edney Brown recalls, for example, that one of her supervisors suggested a book about Descartes and the aesthetic experience. She bought the book at great expense, but then never read it because a quick look at the contents page told her it did not fit with the thinkers that she wanted to study. Sometimes you don't yet know whether the information in a text will be useful to your thesis or not. So it's worth reading then and taking some notes and reviewing regularly. As your project progresses, links between ideas and research will become clearer. Before you read the text for detail, it's important to take its measure in terms of relevance. Save time by checking if this is the right text for your particular needs. Check the title pages, publishing pages, and contents pages. Ask, is the reading on my topic? What does it offer me? Ask, who wrote this? Are they affiliated with any research institution? Are they credible? Can I expect their research and their ideas to be grounded in rigorous thinking or research? Is the article peer-reviewed, and is it published in a high-ranking journal? Ask, does the writer's perspective relate to my work or to something different? And ask about currency. How old is the research? Has technology moved on since then? Or are the ideas still fresh today? Checking the year of publication is important, but be aware that topics and perspectives come and go in popularity. And this might mean that many of the publications that reference your topic may be more than 20 years old. This activity takes you through the first critical reading steps. We're going to refer to a simple article titled Trees and Urban Forestry in Beijing, China. If you haven't downloaded the article from the critical reading page, you might want to do it now. Imagine that you're working on a thesis project that has the title Urban Forestry, a Cultural Perspective, and your aim is to examine cultural elements of urban forestry using case studies from Melbourne, Australia and Beijing, China. The research is multidisciplinary in that it combines cultural studies with forestry science or arboriculture. Your mission is to skim through the text and assess it for currency, authority, topicality, and perspective. You must decide if the article is relevant for the research topic. When you've finished, check out the comments on the next slide, so pause the video now. This is my assessment of the relevance of the article. Let's see if you agree. A brief overview suggests that it is quite relevant to the thesis topic. Its title is closely related, although we're not sure if it will discuss cultural practices. We need to flip through the text to find evidence of cultural information. Its perspective is close to the thesis objectives, with a Beijing focus. And regarding authority or credibility, while the journal ranking is rather low, it is peer-reviewed, and George Profess is a credible researcher, in particular because he has sought information and advice from forestry experts in Beijing. What is at issue is the currency of the journal article. It is over 25 years old, and if we think about the massive changes that have taken place in Beijing over the last 25 years, we need to ask, can it be relevant today? The same cultural and forestry management principles might apply, for example, despite the city's transformation, or they may have changed dramatically. This is something that we will need to follow up. In summary, I think this article is an excellent starting point. Even though it is out of date, it gives me a list of forestry management principles and cultural practices to compare with contemporary Beijing and Melbourne, Australia. You're about to move on to the part 2 of the reading, and in that workshop you'll look at reading in detail using questioning techniques to get the most out of the text. And here's a little quote from Adrienne Rich, and it emphasises the influence of reading on our whole embodied experience, the intellectual and the emotional. And I hope your research grabs you and that the researchers and authors you read change your life. Cheers.